Okay, afternoon. We're going to give it just another minute or two since lunch is finishing up, and then we'll get started. Yeah, just another minute or so, and we'll get started. Okay, so first off, thanks for joining us. We're going to talk a little bit about access for AWP projects. If you've been to the conference over the last 5-6 years, you've seen some of this material, but we always end up, learning some things ourselves and adding to it. So I'm Rick Dunlap. I'll also have a couple of our team members, Vince Starter, as well as Glenn Young, attending. We all have a little different backgrounds, but we're all very focused on AWP projects. So what I'm going to cover today is really just a quick infomercial about who BrandSafway is and why this topic's important to us, quite honestly. A couple of slides on some industry, challenges and some of the approaches that have been taken. I want to spend a good amount of time on the AWP framework and specifically about access, and then we'll share some of the things that we do specifically at our company to address, AWP, how we deal with CWPs, and ultimately how we deal with constraint management at the IWP level. So BrandSafway, quick infomercial. We're in 30 countries, 300 locations. About half our business is access related. The majority of that is scaffold, but we do a lot of other things. So we're very focused on the pain point the industry has around access cost, and we're always trying to figure out how to solve that issue with our clients. So any questions, www.brandsafeway.com, and lots of materials there. So access, if you saw the 11 o'clock CII presentation, access is a pain point for our clients and our owners that we work with. And so if it's a pain point for them, it's a pain point for us, obviously. I think access has been treated sort of simplistically over the last 20, 30 years. And I think now when people actually sit down and count what's happening around access, you can see that access hours can easily be 20% of the hours on a project, but more importantly, access hours can impact 80% plus conservatively of all the work done on a project site. So long story short, access really does matter.
I think Rick, yep. Comment on that slide that I found kind of interesting this morning on our introductory plenary session about materials management. Annabella had that same number, 80% relative to materials. The spin was on the front end. She said it was like 40 to 50% of cost would be materials, but the impact was the same. And I think there is a direct corollary there. If you don't get your materials right at the right time and the right location, you can't be productive. And the same thing with access. You can have the best laid plan, nice IWPs. If you don't take care of the constraint relative to your access, then you're inhibited from performing work. So a lot of truth to solving both of those riddles.
Yeah, good point. So we'll be, I'll be honest, access is important to us, but we're also ready to move on to some of the other services that we do. Specifically, another pain point for us is installation services on these AWP projects, and materials management becomes a huge dynamic in that. So moving on to what we typically see in the marketplace, in traditional construction methods or even AWP methods, we typically see standard commercial strategies. Client hires an EPC. EPC has a game plan. EPC builds plant. Project starts very basic. They start to do some lean activities. They start to really kind of hit their stride, and about the time all the providers on the job site, including access, really get aligned and working well, the project's wrapping up, and everyone picks their stuff up and goes home. A year later, next client starts their project, and the cycle sort of rinse and repeats itself, right? So the real opportunity we see with AWP is that whole ecosystem, and if we just did it in more of a program approach, I think we could actually start to cultivate some value. So in order to do that, we really need people who understand the AWP framework. The client needs to help create that ecosystem really with commercial strategies and contract models that kind of tie us all together in terms of delivering a project versus just managing a contract. The AWP framework, I think a lot of times people think that competes with traditional methods or lean or other things. Actually, the AWP framework is a great vessel to kind of bring all those people together and let all those aptitudes and capabilities sort of work themselves.
Coalesce the concepts.
Yep, absolutely. So if you look at the charts at the top, essentially that's the cycle of Groundhog Day, rinse and repeat, do it over and over again. I think leveraging AWP, that common framework, a lot of the data standards, and ultimately a lot of the lessons learned that could come from using this process or this framework repeatedly start to really help us start a little higher than we did on the individual projects by themselves, and really get some scale, start to have some organizational aptitude and a maturity model around what AWP is and how it can help you for all the crafts, but specifically in this case, access. So I put this slide together a couple of conferences ago, but I think it still sort of resonates. And the point is not to look at all the numbers. The point is that an owner and an EPC, or an owner and a group of contractors have a concept to build a facility. They bid that, they have a cost estimate, they start that project, and somewhere along the way things kind of get more complicated. They start to write multiple contracts, they forget to cascade what everyone else is doing, and we end up in the field with typically a bad result, especially around access. And what's driving that is all these different contract models. Different people have access included in their fee. Some of the access is provided as a shared service, maybe by the owner, and we end up with rebuilding excessively the same scaffolds over and over, craft by craft. We're managing multiple contractor plans and multiple data models that are required. And then really and truly what happens is we end up modifying scaffolds over and over again. If we did this more as a shared service and did it in an aligned approach, what we could end up with is really a client and owner really driving a good commercial strategy to have us all work together. Access can start to be treated as a discipline, whether that's a single provider on a job site or multiple providers. It's really that shared service model. And what we mean by that is a scaffold tag means the same thing to everyone. We know, when it was built, when it's supposed to come down, what its dimensions are, all the data around it, so that others can potentially use that scaffold. How we ask for scaffolds, how we plan scaffolds should be a consistent approach versus, daily, emergency firefights for access for critical welds or anything else that might happen. But really and truly, what we're really pushing for is to really be included in a more strategic way so that we can help set some of the access strategy. And that would happen at the construction work package level within a discipline, and then ultimately interdiscipline, right, across multiple disciplines, so that we can deliver value to the ecosystem of the project. So as an example, a lot of times, I'll point these metrics out. A lot of times what our clients bid is somewhere around 10 or 15% of DFL. Whether you agree with that metric or not, it is a common metric that's used, especially early in a project, because we don't have actual scope yet as an access provider. What we hear the results coming in as is anywhere from that 10 or 15% to 30% or more. If you think about what that means in terms of a project, we can pretty quickly go from 150,000 man-hour scaffold access spend to 400,000 or 500,000 man-hour scaffold access spend. Depending on the market, non-union or union, that you can do the math pretty quickly. It could total the tens of millions of dollars in impact. So it does matter, and we're trying to help look at it. So one of the slides that I always like to point out, and it's really a good example of what we do in traditional construction methods, whether you're on the engineering or procurement side or you're in the field doing the actual construction activity. There's a myriad of contract models. There's a myriad of experiential items, relationship items, all of those things really kind of set up and create what I call the chaos model. And if you're the lowly, scaffold provider on a job site, you're sort of at the mercy of all these people who need your service. We really like the AWP model because in the green bar, it's really straightforward. It says, AWP helps us think about things in an integrated planning way. We can think of it as a shared service, and we're actually all pulling the cart in the same direction in that ecosystem. And really, it's not that difficult. It's really about having a common approach or vessel. That's AWP. The data standards, how you ask for things, what are the inputs and outputs to the access planning process? What are the dates? All of those things. And then last but not least, the commercial strategy is not so much the commercial strategy about how low the rate is for your access provider, but it's about how the access users and the access provider work together to have a consistent process to manage access cost and start to do multi-user scaffolds instead of individual pipe fitters scaffolds. So it's just a good framework. So one of the things I always point out, this is a COA chart. Actually, it's about 10 years old now, but I do like to point it out every time because I think it's spot on. But as an industry, we all spend a lot of time trying to build our own aptitudes, and a lot of times that's basic project management, PMBOK related items, as well as our own internal project management approaches for work that we do. We're also pretty keen on the lean approaches, right? So what's a more efficient way to do things? How do I take waste out of process? And then last but not least, we always see our clients with a variety of strategies for risk mitigation, cost management, and even trying to drive innovation into the contractors. In our case, clients will often ask, hey, can you do this lump sum, or will you do it unit rate? They think somehow that's mitigating their risk. Well, really what it's doing is setting this up to manage a contract and management of change around that contract versus delivering the project. Will we do all those things? Absolutely, it's just math for us, but the real root cause of access cost has nothing to do with the contract model per se, the basis of that contract. A lot of times we're asked to work with other providers providing similar service, and that's fine. We do that all over the country, all over North America and the world. That in and of itself, may motivate individual crew foremen to not be outdone by someone else's foreman, but ultimately it's not getting at the root cause of what's the real issue. And then lastly, can you do rope access? Can you use mechanical lifts? Absolutely, we can do all of those things, and they're tools in our toolbox. Are they the right tool for every job? Not necessarily, but can we use them? Sure. Those by themselves won't solve the access cost problem on AWP projects either. So long story short, what we see in industry is still a huge amount of non-tool activity for both our field crews, 40% in this case. And then the bottom chart really illustrates what I think's even more important, and that's the people who manage our field crews. Where are they spending? What's their tool time? And in this case, tool time for a supervisor is really, managing their crew to make sure that they're doing things safe, the right quality, compliance with process, and delivering work activity. So we want to figure out how to solve that and align all the stakeholders who need our service to do that. So that's where we kind of jump back to the AWP model itself. And I will say the AWP framework and specifically WorkFace Planning has helped us really drive a lot of value for ourselves internally and our customers. Can we be better at it? Absolutely, but we're certainly on our way. One of the challenges we have when we work on AWP projects is we see a big mix of the maturity of contractors we interface with and what's their maturity for AWP. The other one is often our clients set interesting commercial strategies that make it very difficult for us to communicate with others on these projects where we could share access with other contractors, multi-user access opportunities. Some of the other things we see is a lack of data standards. Can we improve those? Absolutely. Do we have some? Absolutely. And one of the things that we like to highlight in the data standards is when it comes to project control data, we like to highlight our performance, but we also like to highlight access users, compliance with process, which is a big one. One of the things that's come out of the CII Joint Working Committee and very adamant about it is we really need our project owners to stay engaged and to ensure that everyone complies with process and follows through, not just some of the population, because access is for everyone at the end of the day. And if we're only affecting a % of that access, then we're going to get less than intended results. The other big one that comes out in the AWP model is that all of us in these conferences and actually out on the project sites, we very much understand AWP, we understand the value it can bring, we understand the mechanics of the system. But often what happens is the extended functional groups, whether that's with our owner or internally with our company or other contractors, aren't often included in that education process to understand why it's important that we implement AWP, how we implement it, what's the real value from it. Many times, and I'll pick on sourcing and contracts teams, many times they're focused on assessing and managing providers through the same lens they always have, and that's usually a cost lever or a cost per unit lever in terms of a man hour and those type things. That really undermines the goal of the project. As an example, building very small scaffolds is very cost stewardship minded, but at the end of the day, only one person or one team can use that scaffold as an example. So we have to kind of get past that. Last but not least, I will say that access is really pretty unique service because we're not actually installing any of the process equipment. So we often get left out of a lot of the early constructability discussions and strategy around how construction is going to happen in the field, modules and path of construction and those type things. So including us early helps us do a few things. It helps us actually help you with key solutions like, pulling a coker drum or placing a new coker drum and how to unhook from the crane, those type things without damaging the insulation as an example. Those are things we can help with. We can also help set the access strategy about when people ask for access in a module, how we scorekeep that or how we offer alternatives to scaffold to, save money and add value to the project. Ultimately, what we want to do is get out of the one-to-one, I have a scope of work, I will build you a scaffold scenario and become more of a strategic provider where there are many scopes of work in a given area, and I can provide a multi-user scaffold that addresses many scopes to one access provider.
So Rick, on that point, one of the things that, we're hearing a lot of, and it's very justified, and that's this whole, collaborative ecosystem and things like single source of truth. Those aren't just catchphrases. What the industry is recognizing is the need to be able to collaborate with data. And so the reason this is still a valid point, and you made the comment about some of these slides you've seen before, one of the reasons we still present them is they're still valid. So one of the challenges that still remain in that N-to-one, that many-to-one user relationship, you still have a phenomenon where you have disciplined planners, let's say the piping guy. He knows he needs access at a location. He doesn't necessarily have visibility to the electrical scopes or anybody else's. So there's an overarching need within the industry for systems to truly integrate access. And those people that are also presenting at the same conference, they recognize that and are working on solutions, but there's still work to be done there.
Yeah, and I totally agree, Vince. Thanks for adding that. And I would also add that I think AWP Framework, you can see that I've added like commissioning and startup work packages here. We see that as a huge opportunity for access, but also for insulation as an example. Many times that's not even thought of in the commercial tender for insulation. So moving on, if we could kind of transform how people think about access, I think there's really three key buckets on an AWP project. There's the early critical key solutions that you may need, right? I mentioned a coker drum that you're setting, or some other, a cracker that has to be set, and multiple major pieces of equipment, heavy lifts and all those things that go with it, connectivity of that crane to the structure and how we rig it and all those type things. Those are very valid. One of the things that we see missing is really a cohesive access strategy out, in an interdiscipline sort of approach, meaning at the owner's perspective. We see access strategy quite often set by individual contractors for their specific ISOs they may be installing or for a specific piece of equipment. But when you look at a project holistically, there's really not that overarching access strategy a lot of times. And that needs to happen really in the construction work areas at a minimum, and more around the CWPs. And to us, it's really that intra-discipline. So if we could really help the piping contractor, most projects are piping projects or equipment projects. So if we could help those people within their own discipline really start to think about many scopes for one access construction, and then we can move on to, okay, now I've addressed the piping, now I can address the insulation, maybe the electrical and those type things. We can start to find some population of scaffolds that we don't have to duplicate or triplicate the builds on. So it becomes very powerful. The last piece is really what we've been sort of doing in the industry the last 5, 6, 7 years now, is what I call constraint management. That's when a WorkFace Planning resource for piping or electrical comes in and says, hey, I have a scope, I'm going to do this scope in 7 days, 14 days, 30 days, whatever it may be. We look at it, we go walk that scope or do a model review, and we manage their constraint for them and say, yes, our crew with our materials will be there on this date to do that work. I will say 5 years ago, even that was a challenge. Scaffold was still an emergency because they were all on their own maturity curve, learning how to do AWP for their own craft, much less their constraints. So it's those three things together. I think what kind of I like to highlight is what typically happens is when there's a project, the commercial strategy or the engagement strategy for us as an access provider is usually very late. They want to bring us to site as late as possible. They don't want to have any overhead on site and pay for that costly overhead. Totally understand that in traditional construction methods. But in the AWP framework, I think we have a lot of opportunity to kind of come in early and help with some of those key solutions. really help build the strategy. I don't think we need a full team there. And this curve is just an example as an illustration to say, we see a little early crew and we see some people helping set strategy. But what we're really doing is trying to identify, where is all the work activity? What is the access required? Now I can set a strategy. What are alternatives to scaffold? And how, what's a reasonable assumption for how many of these access points can provide access for many scopes of work versus just the traditional constraint management approach. So, another view of the same issues is just to try to make the point for the people who did join us today is, I think people think of, a scaffold provider as a scaffold provider. I'm using the word very deliberately, access, for a reason, is because we have to think about not only scaffold, but we have to think about it in terms of, other methods like mechanical lifts. We may have some different products that are quote unquote not technically scaffold, but work well with scaffold. We'll highlight a couple of those just as examples. And then there's other things that can be innovative around access, like rope access. So, going back 20 years ago, rope access was going to revolutionize the industry, and everything we do in the field should be rope access. That didn't work out too well, but it's now coming back around where people are understanding there is a certain population of scopes that might be best suited to be performed on rope access, as an example. So the variables around which method we use are, is it one-time visit or is it multiple people? All of those type things decide what is the best method. From there, we can really help set up, that key solution and constructability piece, identify really key things early in a project or for critical scopes. We can help set that CWP level strategy. We understand what methods, we understand what the work packaging system's going to look like. We know what our strategy was to build the plant as well as provide access. What are some of the innovative things we're going to do when we do that, so that when we do actually start seeing the workflow come in, the IWPs start to happen and the construction activities start to occur, we're actually managing the access, and we're focused on constraint management, strategic compliance, reducing modifications, reducing builds. And when we think about it like that, we're really thinking about doing things lean, being more productive, fit for purpose, and many access, many scopes for one access. So it's a combination of a lot of things to kind of get us here. And I think the nice way to say it is you have to have the right set of aptitudes, methods, and capabilities that can, address a wide range of access needs. We have to have a commercial strategy that says, yes, I will make my piping contractor use mechanical lifts, or yes, my access provider can do rope, or he can provide decking systems, as an example. We have to be able to all speak in the AWP framework, and we have to be willing to actually record the data that's required to have some standards and control the work. And what we're trying to call this is really a shared service approach. That way, we're not duplicating, triplicating, or even worse, the access service on these projects, because that's not baked into that client budget for this project. I can assure you, this bid best didn't assume 4 people were going to try and do the work themselves most times. So with that said, a simple illustration just to kind of highlight what typically happens. I left structure out of this just for sake of illustration, but say we're working on a pipeline in the facility, a set of ISOs or a system or a line or whatever we may call it. And the pipe fitting team or the welding team has decided they need 9 access points to do their welding. No problem in an IWP environment. The welder foreman comes and submits his constraint. We plan it, we go build it. That's 9. Okay. Then we may or may not tear all these down. Some point in the future, the poor painter comes along and says, man, I've got to access this pipe rack in 5 locations or 6 locations. I need a scaffold 6 times. No problem. Now it's touched up, and the insulator, which isn't on this list, can come and insulate the pipe. The electrical guy, electrical team, same exact thing. They come along and say, I need to run cable trays here, or hook up thermocouples or instruments. I need 4 scaffolds. So this WorkFace ends up with 19 or 20 scaffolds. If we would have been able to have that view or perspective at the CWA and the CWP and the systems and the commercial agreements and strategies that allowed us to do this, we could actually make this 19 become substantially less. Not to mention, each of these individual scaffolds here could have become 1 or 2 scaffolds, right? And so I try to illustrate that what we're really chasing is a combination of reducing the amount of scaffolds we build, reducing the amount of waste and duplication that we do, and improving the quality of the planning process. Any comments on this one, guys?
Nope.
Okay. So the way to kind of break all that down, it sounds sort of difficult, but really how we look at it is really pretty straightforward. We have a standard scope process. Someone's going to give us scope in an AWP environment. That scope is really clearly understood. It's CWPs and IWPs. That's where we're going to get our scope. We might reference that scope on a P6, but scope comes from the work packages as it stands today. Once we scope it, then we go plan it. We create a budget. There's a bit of a debate in the working committee about, do we actually plan and budget each individual scaffold? Not necessarily, but if we're not planning or budgeting for scaffolds, then we certainly need a way to record actual units installed so that I can extrapolate a budget from it. So long story short, let me finish. So once we've actually created that work package, it's approved, we go to the field and execute it. Now we have scaffold and access standing all over the project or all over the facility. We need to understand where that is, what are the parameters of it, when it's supposed to come down, et cetera. So what we focused on is creating, processes to help us address all these pieces of that in a many-to-one environment, not just a one-to-one environment. So I'm going to skip that slide. One of the things, I'm going to kind of jump into some of the specifics. One of the things, when someone asks us to provide scaffold or access for them, and we have a broader capability than just scaffold, we can think about other ways to do things. And the only reason I'm showing these products is to say, do we really need to build, as an example, a 200-foot tall scaffold? In a new construction project, the answer may be, almost always yes, I have to do that because electricians need to make connections and insulators need to finish insulation and those type things. But maybe in a brownfield project, I can simply make a connection and use a cable suspended platform or a basket to do that. Same thing here with, say, a decking solution. Instead of building the 19 scaffolds you saw, maybe I can build the majority of that workface out with a decking system, and I can do that one time, and now I've avoided, a large number of scaffolds. The others are just interesting products that help us, heat and hoard or do some of those things. The takeaway is it's not always just a scaffold. So one of the other things that we've been very adamant about, I would say we really help drive a lot of change in our company, but also in others' companies. We really help change a lot of the perception. When people ask for things, we want to be able to create a visualization of that. That visualization should have some parts quantities. It should have some estimated resource in terms of hours and maybe even cost, so that now we know what they meant when they asked for something. The advent of 3D has been really, really huge the last 10 years. We can simply integrate a lot of our temporary works into a variety of review models to help us not only create a work package, but validate with the access user, is this what you meant? Is this what you meant? Is this what you meant? And get some value from that. And then even when we don't have, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to add, that's the term, a picture is 1,000 words. And when you when you just put it on a screen and you share it with all the crafts, it's so easy to just walk through a model and, you know, you're in a geographic space, and we need to think geographic space and all the activities that go in that area. And like you'd said earlier, N to one instead of 1 to 1, and all the crafts need to see it. And
yep. Yep. Yeah, the last piece is, do we need all this to follow a process? Not really, but it is helpful, right? And so even when we don't have 3D models, we can still do things that help drive out efficiencies and alignment. Sometimes that's point cloud data. We'll use that too. One of the things we like to do is we have a simple planning tool. It can be CAD, it can be, you know, Bentley system, it can be whatever your company likes, but ultimately we don't think everything needs to be engineered. So the scaffold systems in general are pre-engineered, so we can enter some basic parameters, IWP, hit design. I now have a piece of access. If I need to customize that access, I can do that. I can drive out a set of data in terms of my material constraint for my constraint. I'm managing your constraint as a piping contractor. My constraint is also my materials, right? So I need to have that. I can pre-kit those materials. I need visualizations for our field teams to make sure that the person who scoped and planned this work conveys how it's supposed to be built in the field to the execution team. And then lastly, the execution team can go out and use these work packages with a pre-kit or with a material pick list and be much more efficient than driving around the facility trying to figure out what they're doing, when they're doing it, and why they're doing it. So we find work packaging for access is pretty powerful. The value that we get from it is really sort of that early stuff. We can find better ways to do things versus traditional scaffold or small scaffolds, as an example. We can improve our safety, quality, productivity when we do this. We can do things wiser and smarter, which result in that, right? And we can take some of the hours out of a project by doing those things wiser and smarter. The WorkFace Planning piece, really that constraint management piece, it really just validates that when we do something, we're not going to go out and have to redo it near as much. One of the dynamics that happens on projects for us is the sort of the quality metric for us is modifications. And if we're modifying everything we build, we're not doing a very good job of listening what's needed or being told very well what's needed and going out and doing something without a real plan around doing it. That's what it's basically saying. So when we do that well, then really the accountability starts to fall on us to say, okay, I know what we're going to do this. I know how we're supposed to do it, what it's supposed to look like. Now I have a work package that says, here's all the materials, here's what we're supposed to build, where we're supposed to build it, and how. This helps our teams be more efficient. So over on the right, I have a couple of images. This is a real project we did going on 5 or 6 years ago. I use this example. It's still one of my favorites, but prior to this exercise with this particular client, it was every pipe fitter just called and made a scaffold request. And so the crew would run out and do whatever they needed taken care of. A subsequent project, we said, hey, let us come in and actually do some WorkFace planning, help you identify all these requests, group these requests together and start to think about this a little smarter. This particular scaffold would have originally, I'm going to show that on the next chart, would have been 10 scaffolds or multiple scaffolds. What it ended up being was really this one large scaffold. Procurement and sourcing people don't like to see large scaffolds because they see the price tag, but what they don't see is the number of small scaffolds and the velocity of how many small scaffolds happen on a project. But you can see all the individual scopes of work that were addressed with one single access point. So that's the way we like to look at it. Glenn, you want to say something on this one?
I do. That list that you see on the right, that list was generated by summing areas in the 3D model. So all the electrical components, the field welds, the locations of them, we actually generated all these lists just from the geographic space and the size of the scaffold. And you know, that data is there and it's very useful
Yeah.
to.
And the reason we had to do that is because we're truly still not integrated into the CWP level of work packaging on a project, right? How do we get a seat at the table with the GCs and EPCs to make sure that we can facilitate this? So we're having to do it sort of manually, but where there's a will, there's a way, right? So this is that exact example. What this was 10 separate requests, and we said, well, do we really want to go build 10 little bitty scaffolds and address all these little individual work scopes, or do we want to do this perfectly? Well, there were some dynamics around doing it perfectly because some of the equipment wasn't installed yet, so we couldn't do it perfectly. But what we could do is do it better than what we were going to do it, and do it in a many to one type approach. And the real value for us is not only, I may build a little bigger scaffold, might cost a little bit more per drink, so to speak, but what you're saving is a lot of little bitty drinks, and that non-tool activity is really the payoff for us. So I'm not overstaffed. I'm not doing those things. I'm doing this with work packages for our access, so I'm not having to modify it near as much. There's just a lot of value opportunities when we look at it this way.
The session earlier was talking about AWP and scaffolding and referring to return on investment. When you look at this, these scaffolds all on top of each other, every time I build a four-legged scaffold and I have to put a ladder system is a big part of scaffolds. In some plants that we're breaking ladders every lift or every second lift. So there's a lot of money just in the ladders. Well, when you start building a second bay into a scaffold, it's 50% more legs, 3/4 of the horizontals, but there's no more ladders there. So bigger is better. We're thinking now, and it was refreshing to see the session earlier was talking into one instead of one-to-one also. So as that term gets out there further, more people are going to get it. Anytime, and it's also mobilization time too of going there to build 3 different ones versus the one bigger scaffold. So
that's the non-tool time. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I'm trying to be cognizant of time, so we have about 10 minutes to kind of wrap this. So I show these charts, and the reason I keep showing them is because there's still a lot of opportunity for us to deliver this way, because even today, as early as right before the COVID impact, we were working on several large projects and several large GCs, and we were going down the same exact path. And we're begging our teams and our customer teams not to do this, because it just turns into a weekly sort of, why are scaffold hours so high? So to describe this project, we walked in, planned about 800 scaffolds. The learning from that, I'll be perfectly honest, is that we probably should have only planned the ones that we needed to plan, because we were taking some really big guesses as to what the scaffold needs would be 7 to 8, 9, 10 months later. They weren't critical scope and they weren't major scope. So we try to focus now on planning the critical and major scopes early, and then having good WorkFace planning process 30 days out to plan all those transactional scopes of work, make sure they align with strategy and do them. So we started this project. It was still very successful. We were beating manpower estimates, man-hour estimates. We were managing costs very well early. The challenge is that there was a lack of process compliance by the access users. And so they were screaming for access immediately. They were deviating from the scaffold request and WorkFace planning process. And what we ended up with just a few weeks into the project was 40% of our man hours are basically going to scaffold modifications. Again, focused on the wrong things. Hurry up and mess up is sort of the message there. Scaffold modifications are an indicator of the quality of your planning and the related process. So the good news was the client here listened, and we were able to sort of do this culture change over a 6-week period and really bring modifications into much bigger, much tighter control, which ended up saving I would argue that, 8 or 10 weeks later, this number would have been 80 or 90% of our hours, which means why is scaffold always double? The punchline is really simple. I use it every time I show these slides. One crew, the original intended crew in hours, built the scaffold and access. The doubling is the crews that had to go back and modify and rebuild those same scaffolds because they were poorly communicated and poorly scoped and poorly executed ultimately in the field.
One of the first takeaways from your morning session was getting the owner involved. And that's exactly what happened here. It took the owner to get involved to kind of say, time out, this is the way we're going to do it. And without that owner involvement, that could have been a much different situation.
Mm-hmm.
This is go ahead, Rick. You want me to take it?
Not to belabor it, but what's a work package, right? So a work package says, hey, I need some method to capture scope. I need to interpret that scope, consume it, digest it, create some output for them to confirm, and then for us to share with our teams. That's really the takeaway here. Go ahead.
This is another return on investment issue. If you picture a foreman having 4 crews, first thing in the morning, if you can give a scaffold crew a picture like this that's so self-explanatory, where to go, what to build, the material list and all, these are the kind of things where foremen don't have to hand feed and walk them to a site while the others are twiddling their thumbs waiting for the foreman to come around. All these crews can go to work from the start. Then you can use that experienced foreman with more planning and packaging and stuff ahead of time. So it is a big efficiency. And I've always said that with this type of pre-planning, a crew can build an extra half, if not an extra whole scaffold in a day. And that's some of the things we're seeing. So you'll see in later graphs.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I just illustrated, what that really looks like. So one of the other things that we always talk about is, when we're doing WorkFace planning, a lot of times the review models are great. The construction models are fantastic. Sometimes we actually physically need to go to the field and see that activity, make sure that structure is really there. Or when is that structure supposed to be there, because it's not there today, right? So we need to understand some of the on-the-ground dynamics, not just plan from a model. So what we do is we use mobility. We set our tools up to actually walk scopes down, capture all this data, including metadata. That's GPS, images, any other pertinent markups that we may do. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is, I don't want to always just point at the scaffold users as the bad, or access users as sort of the bad actors. Sometimes we need to make sure that our teams who plan things communicate well with our field teams who go build things and do things. So this is an alignment tool for not only our customers, but also our teams internally. So now I can have a scope package as well as a work package. So I'm just gonna really fly through these last few slides to leave a few minutes if there's any questions. But whether it's new construction, brownfield construction, whatever it may be, even turnarounds and outages, this WorkFace planning for as-built conditions, laser scanning, we understand it very well. We use it a lot. We've built our own team to do that because we've had a lot of success planning brownfield work as well as turnarounds and outages. We also utilize our clients' point cloud data all the time, and we can repackage it, make it more consumable for field teams to understand and use. But really what we're trying to do is drive out basically the same exact concept, right? So somebody has a scaffold need or access need, we identify it, we go design it, draw it, and ultimately what we want to do is create that work package, right? So what we end up with is this what you meant? And this particular work package uses the imagery. This was a color scan, so we get to do that. But at the end of the day, we want a work package for our teams for a variety of reasons. So even if we're not being strategic on the project, not of our choice, we can still be lean and productive for the work scopes that were provided. Hope that makes sense. So this is a real event. This was one we used, I marked out the names to protect the innocent, but this was about a 500 scaffold turnaround, major turnaround, revamp. We used the system all the way through WorkFace Planning. So some of the benefit of doing WorkFace Planning, right, really has a lot of application to brownfield small cap work, but also turnarounds and outages. I think traditionally those things are staffed and resourced according to how many head counts and for what duration. Anytime we can go out and actually do a bottoms up, scope and WorkFace planning exercise, we can start to reduce a lot of the, I would say, built-in sort of, reliability factor. A lot of our clients do. Bring me 20 guys when they only need 12 or 15 as an example. This particular project, we were able to go scope several hundred scaffolds, execute those in the pre-window, pre-kitted majority of the actual activity. In the turnaround window, we were able to reduce headcount because so much of the scope was already done and the discovery work was substantially reduced. And then in the post, we actually knew exactly what was standing, what it should take to take it down, and what it actually took. So it has applications for everything. Some of the other things, I have about 2 minutes, and I'm going to finish up. Some of the other things we're doing, we're following other opportunities, whether it's AR. So we have an AR app that lets our field teams see designs. We get them to place them in the as-built condition, send them back to us, those type things. So we see that in the next 5 years being bigger for our company. So earlier I touched on, okay, we set up a process, we had a strategy, we WorkFace planned. Okay, now a bunch of stuff's out there standing. Where's it all at? So one of the questions we always got asked is, where's all the stuff at, and when's it supposed to come down? So what we do is we use a digital tag management system to allow us to understand what is actually out there, what's it look like, what's its status, what materials are on it, and what can be, if I'm going to tear one down, can I rebuild it, just down the alleyway? Sure, I can. Do I need to move more material in? All those type things that come from it. So it's really pretty straightforward. Every time we build, dismantle, inspect, modify scaffolds, we document that, record it, and utilize that data for not only our teams, but also our clients' teams, so they can share it with others. So maybe we don't need a new scaffold. There's already one there, as an example. So we like to be able to see the data from it. What's the history of that? How many times was it modified? If it was modified 19 times, that says somebody didn't do a very good job planning the scaffold, as an example. But sometimes we just want to know, was it inspected and what's its status? So being able to have this data and share it with the project teams, pretty important. So I don't want to oversimplify it, but it's really pretty straightforward. I'm going to go build or do a transaction on a scaffold. I'm going to give it a status. I'm going to fill out some data. I talked about data standards. I might record, some material items, and then I want to make sure I know where it's at. I may need someone to sign for it. I may not. And then that data basically goes to our system. So to kind of wrap up, I used this slide in the commissioning and startup committee work that we did last year with others, but I think it's still very pertinent. I think one of the things we need to make sure that we do is help our clients understand, improving commercial strategies. That means what as access providers we're accountable for and to provide, but also compliance with process by the access users. I think as we kind of crawl up that maturity curve, we can always be better at the WorkFace planning piece and understanding how to be, leaner and more effective. But really, what we want to drive is for projects with our clients, especially 2 or 3 projects down the road, we need to start being much more strategic about what's the strategic plan for access. Think about that at the CWP, both intra-discipline and interdiscipline. And then last but not least, we're always looking for better methods, tools, and approaches to kind of keep the ball rolling. So that's high level. If there's any questions, we'll be glad to entertain them. So there's only about 12 people in here, so there should be able to be at least one question. We'll give it a minute. I guess we did so good that there's no questions.
Covered
That's
it all.
good. Okay.
Give them just a second. They may be typing some.
Yeah. No worries. Okay, Joan, you see anything coming in? I do not.
We have a question.
Oh, okay.
We have a question, Anne. You can unmute yourself.
Okay, go ahead.
Hey, Rick, how's it going? It's Ann.
Hi, Ann. How are you?
Good. I saw I saw one of your slides where you were talking about, the strategy is to get your access plan incorporated with AWP before WorkFace Planning begins. Could you talk a little bit more about the timeline itself? Could you kind of walk us through, if we're talking about, a structured kind of project timeline, where some of those big milestones incorporate AWP planning and access management?
Yes, ma'am. Yeah, so it really is kind of project by project, but theoretically, right, our scope is the project scope. So as soon as there's a critical piece of equipment or a critical strategy about how I'm going to place vessels and those things happen very early in the path of construction kind of conversation. So there's a little bit of, let me go back to that chart. Maybe I didn't say it well enough. But yeah, so I think early on, there's a small team of people that might help solve some of those critical to quality on the project items, right? Like, large towers and, laying towers down, standing them up, setting at, crackers, those type of things. The access strategy to me should happen once the CWAs are assigned and we know who the mechanical or, all the disciplines are who are going to actually do the work activity. So I don't need to know where every pipe or every weld is on a pipe to set a strategy. I need to know that those things are happening in a stick-built section of pipe rack, or they're happening in a module, as an example. So the timing is when CWAs and CWPs are set and the disciplines are understood, then we can start that strategic planning. Does that help?
Yes, that is perfect.
Okay, perfect. Okay, thanks for the question, by the way, Ann.
And we have a question from Mark.
Okay.
He says, nice job, especially your turnaround approach. Have you addressed best approaches for multi-projects or multi-contractors in the same footprint?
In terms of access providers or in terms of access users, I guess is the question.
Let's ask Mark to unmute himself, and I will also do what I need to do from this end.
Okay.
So Mark Lambert, there you go, Mark.
Hey, Rick.
Hey,
nice job. Yeah, one problem I've seen over the years is when you have a lot of small projects, maybe congested in a small area, and maybe they even have different contractors, construction contractors working on those, and maybe a single access provider. That always seems to be a challenge.
Yeah, so same exact thing that I was trying to touch on here, Mark, is for small capital programs, they usually kind of change out different folks to kind of, resource load them appropriately for capability or whatever it may be. In other words, they might use 2 or 3 piping contractors. The only way that can get solved, in my opinion, is we have to kind of think of AWP as a program, and there has to be a program coordination person. So I would argue that we have to start thinking about those things for all providers as more of a shared service, right? But access for sure. We have to have the ability to see 4 or 5 small cap projects, schedule, workload, priorities, and ultimately work packages to be able to kind of manage all that. Because sometimes one person's, best access is impeding someone else's activity, to your point, right? And so somehow they have to be integrated. And I think it happens at the owner level, and I think it's more of a program manager approach for the providers. They have to have that coordination. I hope that answers.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for the question, Mark. Congratulations, by the way. All right. Any others, Joan? I think we're good.
Nope, none no hands raised and no other questions in the questions tab.
Yeah. So, well, thanks to everyone who attended that are still here. So very much appreciated, and let us know if we can ever help you. Thank you very much. Have a great day. Rest of the conference.
Thank y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you.